No one wanted the battered, broken $2 Apache girl until a lone cowboy stepped out and claimed her as kin. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The Arizona sun sagged low, spilling fire across the late afternoon sky. The trading post yard shimmered with heat wagons lined along the hitch rails, the air thick with the bite of tobacco sweat and spilled whiskey. Dust rose in thin clouds with each scuff of boots clinging to the sweat-soaked shirts of men who had circled in for the show. Business had long been forgotten. It was spectacle they came for. At the center, Virgil Tate, half-drunk and mean-eyed, dragged forward a young Apache woman bound by a rope cutting into her wrists. His boots carved lines in the dirt as he hauled her like stock. His collar was stained, his hair plastered with sweat, and his laugh came jagged, cruel. $2. That's all she's worth. $2 damn for a woman strong enough to scrub floors, cook hall water, whatever a man demanded. His coarse voice cracked through the heat, forcing silence. She stumbled when he shoved crashing to the dirt, her thin dress slipping from her shoulder. She caught herself with tied hands, scraping skin raw. For a moment she stayed on her knees, chest heaving before lifting herself slowly, head bowed, long dark hair veiling the bruises and swelling on her face. Her dress was ripped near through neckline, torn her skin, showing blotches of blue-yellow and angry purple marks of boots, fists, and neglect. She stared at the ground, not out of shame, but survival. To meet their eyes was to feed them. Spit hit the dirt. Some of the townsfolk of Dusty Creek chuckled. One spat tobacco and muttered, "Not worth the feed," before drifting toward the saloon. Another shook his head, grumbling about trouble not worth buying. Virgil cursed and yanked the rope. $2. She's young, she's strong. What the hell's wrong with you cowards? Each word lashed her tighter. She swallowed throat tight and stayed silent. To run meant a bullet. To speak meant a fist. Her heart hammered steady and fast. She told herself to breathe. Stay upright. At the yard's edge stood Wade Fletcher. 34 broad shoulders under a sweat-stained hat, dark hair shadowing a scar that ran from cheekbone to jaw. A scar born as a Union scout. He'd come only for flour coffee and a new pair of shoes for his horse. Wade had no taste for men's cruelty, but he hadn't turned away yet. He watched Virgil and the crowd with the same grave stillness he'd carried since the war. His jaw set. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim. He'd seen enough blood and cruelty to last a lifetime. And this felt too familiar. A life tossed aside as though it meant nothing. Wade wasn't a man who leapt without weighing. He measured choices like a rider measures the sky before a long trail, slow, deliberate. But watching her hands tremble as she fought to stand stirred something in him. No reason could quiet. The voices of war echoed in his head, officers barking, men begging. He knew he would not walk away. His fingers brushed the coins in his pocket. $2 silver. He'd meant them for nails and lamp oil, but this wasn't trade. This was stopping something that should never stand. He stepped forward, boots scraping the hard ground. The crowd hushed. Virgil grinned, thinking he'd won. Wade stopped close, his shadow falling across them both. Without a word, he set $2 silver into Virgil's filthy palm. The coins rang heavy. Virgil blinked, then smirked. Now that's more like it. Wade said nothing. His hand slid to his belt, drawing a knife. The woman flinched, heart thundering, certain this new man was no different that he had bought to own. But Wade dropped the blade to the rope at her wrists and cut it clean. The rope slumped to the dirt, leaving raw welts. She lifted her head just enough to see him sheath the knife. No shove. No claim. Just a quiet act of release. Virgil muttered about trouble, and staggered toward the saloon, already forgetting the woman he'd sold like cattle. The townsfolk of Dusty Creek drifted away one by one, until only silence and dust remained. Wade turned to her at last. Her lips split, her breath shallow, her body swaying like a reed about to fall. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask her story. He only steadied her with a hand at the elbow and led her toward his mule. Her thoughts reeled. She wanted to pull away to run, but strength failed. A voice inside warned this was another chain. Yet in his silence, something felt different. His touch was firm but not cruel, guiding, never forcing. A kindness she hadn't known in years. Wade lifted her carefully onto the mule's back. His hands moved with care, steady enough not to jolt her bruised ribs as he tightened down the saddlebags. Taking the reins, Wade Fletcher started up the trail that wound north into the hills. He kept silent, and Loretta Jane Hollis matched him in that silence. It was a heavy quiet, not born of anger, but of two souls carrying too much sorrow to spill to strangers. As the trading post slipped behind them, Loretta clung to the saddle horn, reminding herself to breathe. For the first time in longer than memory, she wasn't bracing for a fist. She wasn't waiting to be sold again. And Wade Fletcher, a loner, scarred by war and ghosts, told himself he'd see this through. Not because it was easy, but because leaving her in that yard would weigh on him forever. The sun dipped lower shadows, stretching long over the road, and the pair, one broken, one scarred, moved away from the jeers of the townsfolk of Dusty Creek toward a cabin neither yet knew would change them both. The mule carried them north, the wash glowing pale as daylight bled away. The heat eased, replaced by desert coolness scented with sage and creosote. The road shrank to a trail winding through brush and scattered cottonwoods. Dust glimmered faintly in the last light. Loretta swayed in the saddle, sore hands gripping the horn, every step of the mule rattling her battered body. Questions pressed her lips. Where was he taking her? Who was this man? Why had he done what no other had but her throat stayed tight? Instead, she studied the broad set of his shoulders, his steady hand firm on the reins as he walked beside her. Wade hadn't planned to leave town with anything more than flour and coffee. Yet here he was, guiding a mule that bore a woman instead of goods. The weight pressing on him felt like the same burden he'd carried after battlefields when men's lives were tossed aside with the flick of a decision. He had sworn after the war to keep to himself, far from people, and the pain they carried. But standing in that yard today, he'd known he wouldn't rest easy if he abandoned her. That truth was reason enough. An hour's climb brought his cabin into sight, tucked against a low ridge where cottonwoods whispered in the evening breeze. The place was plain one room of pine logs roof, shingled tight smoke, curling thin from a stovepipe. A corral held 2 lean cows, and the faint stretch of ground once planted with beans and corn lay beyond. It wasn't much, but it was his. For the first time, Wade wondered how it looked through another's eyes. He eased Loretta down from the mule. Her breath caught when his hands brushed her ribs, and he stepped back quick to give her space. She stood unsteady, torn dress hanging loose dust clinging to her skin. Her gaze flicked from the door to him, uncertain whether freedom or another trap waited. Inside, he said low, not command, but invitation before he opened the door and stepped aside. The air inside carried wood smoke and the bitterness of cold coffee. A narrow bed sat against the wall blanket, folded neat. A rough-hewn table near the stove, 2 chairs, one worn by years of use. His rifle leaned in the corner boots, lined tidy by the wall. A home built for one, and he felt its starkness now, as if it might unsettle her. Loretta lingered in the doorway, shoulders tight, eyes scanning as though weighing which was safer, the cabin or the empty land. She remembered the grip of Virgil Tate in town, the eyes that had sized her up like livestock, and though fear pressed her chest, she stepped inside. At least here, there were walls, and no crowd. Wade set the flour and coffee on the table, then pulled a bar of soap and a folded cotton shirt from a chest, laying them on the bed. Loretta's eyes narrowed, suspicion tightening her brow. For a long moment she thought it a trick that he meant for her to wash and then give herself. Her heart pounded against her bruised ribs, fists clenched. But Wade only turned away, stoking the stove, setting water to boil. His back to her shoulders, hunched, no eyes on her, no pressure. She studied him, waiting for the demand that never came. Slowly her breath steadied. She picked up the soap with trembling fingers, ran her hand over the shirt. It was coarse cotton, worn but clean. She understood it was all he had to give. Wade lowered himself into the chair by the stove, tipping his hat down. "You can wash," he said in that flat, steady tone. "I'll stay put." He didn't turn to look. She caught the meaning privacy choice things long denied her. She washed with basin and cloth, warm water, stinging cuts, and her split lip. Dirt and blood lifted, leaving her raw but clean. Pulling the shirt over her frame, it hung loose, falling past her knees, covering the ruined dress she folded aside. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she didn't feel eyes on her body. Wade listened to the scrape of cloth, the soft slosh of water, his thoughts circling. He hadn't planned this far. He knew nothing of her story, who had tied her, who had beaten her. He only knew pressing now would shatter the fragile peace they'd found. She would speak when she chose. When she finished, Loretta sat on the edge of the bed, legs trembling with exhaustion. She lifted her gaze at last. He wasn't watching her. His eyes fixed on the fire scar, pale in the glow, jaw locked. She realized he was worn too, just in a different way. For a moment she almost asked why. Why he spent his money, why he cut the rope, why he hadn't walked away like the others. The words sat on her tongue, but she let them fall. For now, keeping quiet was easier. Wade Fletcher leaned back in the chair, arms resting loosely across his chest. "Get some rest," he said, his voice steady but soft. "You'll need it." So Loretta Jane Hollis eased herself onto the bed, pulling the blanket tight. The cotton shirt carried the faint scent of soap and wood smoke. She rolled to face the wall, clutching the blanket edge with both hands. Her body stayed taut for a long while, bracing for footsteps, for a hand reaching toward her. None came. Only the creak of Wade's chair, the sigh of his boots near the stove. He wasn't moving closer. He was standing guard. Her pulse slowed, her breathing evened. In that small cabin, with firelight dancing against log walls and no jeers in her ears, she felt a ghost of something almost forgotten. Safety fragile, but real. She closed her eyes at last, and Wade sat with hat tipped low, eyes half shut, but ears sharp, holding watch until night sank deep. Dawn slipped through the cracks of the shutters, painting pale stripes across the floor. The stove had burned down to glowing coals, leaving the air cool enough that Wade's breath showed faint when he exhaled. He had dozed only in brief spells, his chair never far from the fire boots planted firm. Years of scouting had trained him to sleep light, and it never left him. When he finally stirred upright, the sound woke Loretta. She blinked, blanket pulled tight to her shoulders. For a heartbeat, she panicked, unsure of where she lay. Then her eyes found the cabin walls, the bed beneath her, Wade at the stove. Her breath eased. The question that haunted her sleep returned. Was this man simply waiting for the right moment? Or was he truly different? Wade poured water into the kettle, setting it to heat. He could feel her eyes on him, but didn't turn. He wanted to give her space. Without looking, he said, "Coffee'll be ready soon. There's bread and beans, too." His tone was plain, even neither coaxing nor commanding, just his steady way. Loretta sat up slowly, ribs, sore legs heavy. She pulled the shirt closer around herself, her gaze landing on the torn dress folded near the bed. Her thoughts turned in circles. Why had he bought her? Why hadn't he spoken of what he wanted? Every man she'd known had wanted something. His silence unsettled her. She watched him cut bread from a tin loaf, his movements practiced steady as if he'd done it 100 times before. He set a plate on the table, motioning for her to sit. She hesitated, then crossed the room and lowered herself into the chair across from him. Her hands trembled as she reached for bread, not only from hunger, but from waiting for his claim. Instead, Wade ate quietly, leaving space open between them. The silence stretched, but it wasn't sharp. It was steadying. After a while, he spoke. "You'll need clothes that fit. That one won't do." His eyes flicked to the torn bundle. "I'll ride into town later this week." He asked nothing more, said it like a settled matter. Loretta studied him, uncertain what to make of a man who had bought her out of that yard only to offer food space and talk of clothes. Suspicion gnawed one side, but on the other a spark of cautious trust. She tested him with a question, her voice rough from long silence. "Why did you pay?" Wade set down his cup, eyes meeting hers, steady, not hard. "Because leaving you there was wrong. $2 didn't matter. You did." He added nothing, didn't soften it with fine words. Just truth, bare and simple. She held his gaze, then looked down. The answer struck too direct to be a trick. Something inside her shifted. He wasn't going to explain further. He was not a man who spoke more than needed. Later that day, Wade carried wood for the stove. Setting it down, he saw Loretta at the small chest where his trail coat lay. Without asking, she took needle and thread, began stitching a tear in the lining. Wade paused, watching. It was the first choice she'd made since stepping into the cabin. He said nothing, but inside he felt a faint easing. Maybe she was starting to see this place as more than a stop on her way to nowhere. That evening the fire glowed warm against the logs. Loretta sat at the table, his mended coat folded beside her hands, quiet in her lap. Wade sat across, sharpening his knife. Steady strokes filling the silence. She thought of his words about $2 meaning nothing, of the distance he'd kept, the way he hadn't touched her without cause. Something told her he deserved more than silence. Her chest tightened. Names had always been dangerous. Names could be twisted, used against you. But here, with his eyes steady in the firelight, holding it back, weighed heavier than the risk of sharing. "My name." Her voice caught, but she pressed on. "Loretta." Wade looked up from the knife. He repeated it once, firm and even. "Loretta." He gave a single nod, then returned to the blade. He didn't press her, didn't ask for more. Just accepted it, as if the name itself was enough for now. He accepted it, as though a name alone was all that mattered. For the first time in longer than she could recall, Loretta Jane Hollis felt seen, not as a burden, not as a body, but as a person. That thought lingered with her as she pulled the blanket close later that night. She lay listening to the stove tick as it cooled, the faint creak of Wade Fletcher's chair as he shifted by the fire. The fear that had gripped every breath since the trading post eased a fraction, replaced by something she scarcely recognized. Not safety yet, not trust, but the beginning of both. By week's end, the flour sack was near empty, the coffee tin scraped down to one last pot, and the salt barrel nearly bare. Wade had known from the first morning that a trip to town couldn't be avoided. He waited through, giving Loretta time to heal and gather strength. Supplies weren't optional. They meant survival. The night before, his steady voice broke the silence. "We ride to town tomorrow. Need flour coffee, maybe boots." It wasn't a request, but it wasn't a command either. It was fact. Loretta's chest tightened at the thought. The image of that yard still burned rope at her wrists, laughter spit hitting the dirt. Every day since she had wondered if townsfolk would remember, if faces would sneer, if someone might try to take her back. Still she nodded. He was right. Food would not appear on its own. She told herself she would walk beside him, not behind. At dawn, Wade saddled the mule, and his gelding checked straps twice and tied the empty flour sack across the horn. From his chest he pulled a plain wool shawl. "Wear this," he said. "Wind'll cut sharp." She wrapped it around her shoulders, hiding the thin cotton shirt he had given her. The old dress, torn past modesty, had been cut into rags and burned. It no longer existed. The long trail gave her mind room to wander. She wondered about Wade as much as about herself. Why had a man who lived alone stepped in that day? Did he expect something she hadn't yet understood? He hadn't touched her except to help her down from the mule. He hadn't pressed for her story, hadn't asked for her body. That alone made him unlike every man she'd known in the last year. She didn't trust easily, but with each day in his cabin the fear eased a little. By mid-morning the town came into sight, sunlight glinting off window glass, smoke curling from chimneys, the clatter of wagons, and men's voices carrying down the street. Loretta's stomach knotted. She pulled the shawl tighter, fingers gripping until her knuckles whitened. Wade noticed, but said nothing. He simply kept his gelding steady beside the mule, his hand loose on the reins, his presence making clear she wasn't alone. They tied up outside the general store. Eyes turned at once. A ranch hand leaning on the post narrowed his gaze, whispering to the man next to him. Two women paused on the boardwalk, one clutching her basket, the other tugging at her sleeve to move her along. Loretta felt every stare like stones pressing her skin. She longed to disappear back into the desert. Wade stepped down first, then held out his hand. She hesitated, shame of that yard flooding back. But when she met his eyes, there was no mockery, no impatience, only steady expectation. She placed her hand in his and let him help her down. Standing beside him, she straightened her shoulders. If they looked, they would see her at his side, not something to be sold. Inside the store smelled of flour, leather, and lamp oil. Shelves were crowded with tins of beans, bolts of cloth, jars of nails. The storekeeper, an older man with round spectacles, froze too long before clearing his throat. Wade's voice cut in first. "Need flour, coffee, salt. A bolt of cloth, too blue if you've got it." The storekeeper blinked, nodded quickly, and moved to fill the order. Loretta stood close, hands, folded eyes roaming the shelves. She hadn't set foot in a store since before the raid that took her people. The sight of food stacked neat cloth folded square, it felt strange, almost foreign. When Wade added boots, women's size 6. Loretta's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to notice. She realized he had measured her with his eyes days ago when she crossed his cabin floor barefoot. The thought shook her more than the stairs outside. The door banged open and Virgil Tate swaggered in, whiskey heavy on his breath, though it was still morning. His lip curled when he saw her, then slid to Wade. "Thought I got rid of that problem," he sneered. "Didn't figure you for the type to waste good coin." Loretta's stomach lurched. For a heartbeat, she was back in that yard, wrists burning under coarse rope. Wade stepped forward, not quick but solid, placing himself between her and Virgil. His voice was low, even. You took your money. That ended it. Leave it there. Virgil spat on the boards. She'll bring you nothing but trouble. Wade's eyes never wavered. Then she'll be my trouble. His tone left no room for argument. The storekeeper cleared his throat loudly, setting flour and coffee on the counter. Tension thinned. Virgil muttered curses and stomped outside. Loretta let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding hands trembling as she hid them in her shawl. Wade paid, gathered the goods, and nodded toward the door. Outside, faces still watched, but none stepped forward. He loaded the supplies onto the mule and lifted Loretta into the saddle again. Before she could settle the shawl around her shoulders, Wade Fletcher leaned close enough that only she could hear. You're safe with me. They can look all they want, but no one's taking you. Loretta Jane Hollis swallowed hard and nodded. His words didn't erase the fear, but they steadied her enough to breathe. For the first time since that yard, she believed she might never face those jeers alone again. They rode out slow dust curling behind them, the weight of eyes fading with every mile. Loretta sat straighter in the saddle than she had when they arrived, her grip easier on the horn. Wade rode close at her side, his silence solid as stone. Now she understood why people heeded his quiet words, because he meant every one of them. Back at the cabin, as the sun slipped behind the ridge, Loretta spread the bolt of cloth across the table, running her fingers over its smooth weave. It was hers, bought without shame, chosen with care. Tracing the edge, she felt the first fragile root of belonging sink deep. For the first time, she began to imagine this cabin might not only be his home, it could be hers too. The days after their trip found a rhythm, a steady pattern, that wrapped around them both, turning the place from a stopgap into something like a hearth. The shelves filled again, the bolt of blue cloth, folded neat on the table, until Loretta cut it into pieces with steady hands. Her stitching was practiced from years of making do, and soon a new dress began to take shape. Wade noticed the shift when she slipped it on, the way her shoulders squared, her chin lifted just so. She had burned the ragged dress herself in the pit behind the cabin smoke, curling like a seal over a past she would not return to. That act alone had stirred questions in town, where she'd come from, what she'd endured, how she ended up tied for sale. But Wade and Loretta gave no answers, and the questions died in the dust. The cabin worked because they moved without needing many words. Wade split wood and hauled water, his axe biting deep, while Loretta fed the stove and kept the beans simmering. He patched harness leather at the table come evening, while she sewed by firelight, her fingers neat and unhurried. Sometimes she hummed low tunes from her people, threads of memory and grief woven into the quiet. Wade never asked, but he listened, and the sound filled the cabin with something it hadn't known before. Folks who saw them ride away from town had their own questions. Was she there by choice, or bound in another kind of captivity? Loretta had wondered the same in the dark of night. But each day she chose her place, setting food without being told, pulling weeds in the patch behind the corral, laying Wade's mended coat by his chair. She stayed because she wished to, because the cabin gave back something she thought gone forever, control over her own steps. Wade noticed the change too. He wasn't a man prone to soft thoughts, but he felt it plain. She no longer braced for orders, no longer flinched at every shadow. When he set a blanket on her shoulders, she adjusted it herself, letting her breath settle easy. Trust came in small increments, built not on talk, but on presence. Still, questions lingered. Where was her family? Did anyone search for her? Would someone come? Loretta thought of it often, though she kept it locked inside. She'd been torn from her camp 3 months past when raiders scattered her people. She didn't know if they survived, and if they had, she doubted they'd come searching in a white man's town. The ache of not knowing stayed sharp, but daily work dulled it enough to live. Wade never pressed her. He carried his own ghost's men lost in war, a brother buried back in Missouri land burned under cavalry fire. He knew sometimes silence was the kindest gift. The storm came at week's end, sudden on the horizon, rain lashing hard wind rattling the roofs. Together, they threw canvas across seams, hammering nails as water streamed down their faces. Loretta's hair clung wet to her cheeks, her palms raw from the hammer. Wade passed her, but she didn't falter. She stood her ground beside him until the job was done. When they ducked inside, dripping, Wade built the fire high, and Loretta stripped the soaked shawl from her shoulders, draping it over a chair. For a long moment, they both stood there, breathing hard, the fire steaming their clothes. Their eyes met not in question, but in recognition. They had braced the storm together, and the cabin held. That night they ate in silence, rain pounding the roof, steam rising from coffee mugs. Wade reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. He didn't hold on long, just enough for her to turn her palm and let their fingers rest together, steady and unforced. No one else would ever see it, but in that room the gesture meant more than words. Loretta thought back to the $2 silver, how cheap her life had been marked. She looked at Wade and realized he had never once spoken of it, never used it against her, never claimed a debt. He had given her space to piece herself back together. That truth warmed her deeper than the fire. When the rain eased and the stove ticked low, Wade leaned back, eyes heavy with weariness. Loretta folded the blue cloth neat for morning's work. The cabin no longer felt like a place to wait. It was becoming a place to build. By morning, the air was sharp and clean, the ground damp, the smell of wet earth pushing out the dust. Loretta rose early, hair still heavy from the storm, and set beans to boil. Wade stepped in from the corral boots, muddy jaw tight. She noticed the limp was sharper than usual. She had seen it before and kept quiet, but now the question pressed too heavy to hold. "Your leg," she asked, her voice cautious. "Was it hurt in the war?" Wade froze, caught off guard that she'd broken the silence. Wade set his hat on the table, eyes fixed on the stove's fire. "Bullet at Shiloh. Never healed right. Weather makes it worse." His voice was plain, but the weight behind it was heavy as iron. Loretta Jane Hollis gave a single nod, understanding a little more of the silence he carried. That piece of truth explained what many would wonder, why a man as strong as Wade lived alone away from town without kin or company. His limp slowed his steps, and his ghosts kept him distant. Days fell back into rhythm, but nights were different. Loretta began sleeping lighter, no longer collapsing into bone-deep exhaustion. Too often she woke with breath racing her mind, dragging her back to rope burns, jeers, and dust. She would stare into the dark until her chest eased, clutching the blanket until her fingers cramped. Wade always knew. His chair would creak, and his voice would reach her from the shadows. "You're all right. You're safe here." His words weren't tender or sweet, only steady truth that needed no polish. One night she woke with a cry caught in her throat, sweat dampening her skin, the fire burned low to embers. Wade rose from his chair and stepped closer, not fast, not looming. He stopped at the edge of the bed and waited. Loretta's chest heaved, hands trembling as she pulled the blanket up. Slowly, she reached out, laying her hand over his. Her voice shook. "Stay." He sat on the edge, above the blanket, nothing more. He didn't push closer. She steadied her breathing, holding that hand like a lifeline. Silence stretched, filled with wind outside and the rhythm of their breaths. Her fear eased, not gone, but no longer hers to bear alone. After a long while, Wade spoke. "I won't hurt you." "I know," she whispered, throat tight. It wasn't just belief, it was choice. She chose to say it. As the night deepened, she turned toward him, her forehead brushing his shoulder. He lowered his head, his lips brushing her hair, light, hesitant. For the first time, his affection was unguarded, not an accident of bread or blankets, but a choice. She tilted her head, her cheek grazing his jaw, and their lips met in a slow, tentative kiss. It wasn't smooth, but it was theirs. The questions outsiders might ask, had he bought her for this? Was she bound to give herself? Was it another trade? Found their answer here. No money, no rope, no demand. Just a woman choosing to lean in, and a man steady enough to let her decide. They lay back without breaking that fragile trust. Wade stretched onto the bed, leaving space, his arm resting light across her waist. She placed her hand over his, holding it there. Their breaths fell into rhythm, her eyes closing, not from fear, but from calm. For the first time in months, Loretta drifted into sleep beside someone unafraid of what morning might bring. Wade lay awake, longer thoughts circling. He had never wanted company, never planned for a life beyond this cabin and the small herd in the corral. Yet here she was, changing everything without asking. He stared at the glow of the stove and admitted what he had never spoken: he wanted her here. Not from pity, not from debt, but because silence with her in it was different. When sleep finally took him, the cabin was quiet. The storm of memory eased the night, no longer a place of fear, but the start of something steadier than either dared imagine. Days after that night moved with a new rhythm. Loretta moved through the cabin with purpose, folding laundry by the stove, setting food out before Wade asked, humming as she worked. Wade noticed but said nothing. He let her claim her place as she wished the same way he had once learned to scout a trail, never rushing, never breaking the ground beneath him. Questions outsiders might ask, was she free to stay, or trapped in another man's walls, were answered in the way she carried herself. She could have walked away if she'd wanted. The desert was hard, but not impossible. Still, she stayed night after night with the man who had cut her free with 2 silver coins, and Wade never once reminded her of that trade. In his mind, the matter had ended the moment the rope fell. Spring work carried on fences to mend the small herd, to check the ground behind the cabin, to clear for planting. Loretta worked beside him, pulling weeds, her hands rough on the earth, her back straight. She found herself watching when he bent to test the soil. Broad shoulders straining under his shirt, his limp slowing him, but never stopping him. Once he caught her looking, and gave the faintest smile before turning back to the dirt. It startled her. He hadn't smiled in those first hard weeks. One late afternoon, with the sun burning low, 2 riders crested the ridge above the wash. Wade saw them first, dust trailing behind their horses. His jaw tightened, though he stayed quiet until they came close enough that Loretta heard leather creak and spurs jingle. One was Virgil Tate, his face still red and bloated with drink. The other wore a deputy's badge, scratched dull, a man who'd seen more saloons than jails. Loretta's throat closed memory of the rope burning across her skin. She froze in the yard, the bucket in her hands clattering against hard dirt. Wade stepped in front of her, without a thought, his hand resting near his belt, but not yet on the Colt at his hip. He didn't need to draw, his stillness was warning enough. Virgil spat into the dust. "You owe me, Fletcher. That woman wasn't yours to take." "I want her back, or I want more money." His voice was loud, aiming past Wade to Loretta. The deputy shifted uneasily in the saddle. "There have been complaints," the deputy said, though his words lacked conviction. "Talk of stolen cattle, women being held against their will. I need to hear her say she's here by choice." Loretta Jane Hollis's chest rose hard, fear clawing her throat. For a moment, no sound would come. The memory of the trading yard, the laughter, the spit it pressed too close. But then her eyes found Wade Fletcher's back squared, like stone, holding against both men, and she found her voice. "I stay because I choose," she said firm, though her hands trembled in her skirts. The deputy's gaze lingered, testing her words, but she met it steady now. He gave a single nod, then turned on Virgil Tate. "You took coin for her. That's the end of it. If you've got a complaint, take it to the judge, if you can spell your name." Virgil swore, face-twisting, but he knew better than to push. Yanking his reins, he spat into the dirt and wheeled his horse away, cursing as he went. The deputy tipped his hat toward Wade and Loretta. "Look after each other," he said, then rode off slow behind Tate. When the dust settled, Loretta realized her fists were still knotted in her skirt. She loosed them with a shuddering breath she hadn't known she was holding. Wade turned, then meeting her eyes. For once he spoke more than a single line. "No one takes you from here. Not while I'm standing." Her throat tightened, not with fear this time, but with something steadier. She stepped close, her forehead resting against his chest for a breath. He didn't crowd her, didn't move to hold her. He only stood solid, letting her lean until her strength came back. That night, fire glowing steady while coyotes called far-off Loretta sat at the table, watching Wade sharpen his knife. She had expected men to come. She feared it every day. But now that it had happened and passed, she knew the truth. Wade wouldn't let anyone drag her back to chains, and she herself would never again stand silent in front of men who tried. Her fear hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape. It wasn't the fear of being alone. It was the fear of losing what she'd found something worth fighting for. The days after the deputy's visit carried a different weight. Loretta noticed each time Wade stepped to the corral with his rifle loose in hand, and each time she glanced to the ridge, half expecting riders again. But none came, and the silence after brought fragile peace. Still, questions lingered. What bound her to him now? Was it fear of the world outside, or her own choice? The answer came in what they did next. Wade rose early one morning. "We're riding to the county seat. I want it written down." His tone was plain, but she heard what lay beneath. That paper wasn't for him. It was for her, so no man could twist the truth and claim her again. She studied his face, then nodded. "I'll go." The ride was long, 2 hours of dust and sun over open trail. Loretta sat straight in the saddle shawl, tight against the morning wind. Wade rode beside her, his limp showing in the shift of his weight, but his pace never faltered. She thought of the man who had cut her free, how he had no reason to take on her trouble, yet he had. And now he was leading her to a choice that would decide them both. The county seat was busier than the town near their cabin wagons, stacked with hay voices, shouting deals, women with baskets, children darting through horses' legs. Loretta felt the knot in her stomach, but this time she carried herself different. Her blue dress, sewn by her own hands, fit her shoulders well. The boots Wade had bought carried her steady. She walked beside him, not behind. Eyes still followed, but she met them head-on. Inside the courthouse, the clerk peered over spectacles, but asked nothing. Wade's voice was even. "The woman beside me lives with me by choice. I want it written down." The clerk dipped his pen, scratched words across paper, slid it over. Wade signed bold and sure. Loretta hesitated only a moment before taking the pen, her hand trembling as she formed the letters of her name. Letters she hadn't written in years yet remembered all the same. When she set the pen down, something settled in her chest. She had spoken before a deputy, and now she had written before the county. No one could claim her without breaking the law itself. Afterward, Wade stopped at the general store, bought flour and beans, then paused at the counter. "Got rings?" he asked. The keeper raised a brow, then opened a wooden box. Simple bands of brass and silver gleamed inside. Wade chose one plain piece, paying in coins that could have bought tools. Loretta's pulse quickened. She didn't know what to say. That evening back at the cabin, Wade set the ring on the table between them. He didn't kneel, didn't change his tone. He just spoke the truth as he saw it. "Stay with me for good. As my wife, if you want it." Loretta stared at the ring breath, shallow. Her mind flashed back to that day in the yard, the rope, the laughter that had marked her as nothing. Then she looked at Wade Fletcher, the man who had never treated her as property, who had placed a pen in her hand and let her name stand beside his. Her voice was steady when she answered. "Yes, but as your equal." His lips twitched into the faintest smile. "As my equal." He slid the ring onto Loretta Jane Hollis's finger, his rough hands careful. The band was cool against her skin, warming quickly, not a shackle, but a choice. The fire burned low shadows flickering across the log walls. Their eyes held across the small space, the silence thick, but no longer with fear. Loretta reached across the table, resting her hand over his. When Wade rose, she rose too. Their first kiss by the fire had been tentative. This one was steady, certain, lingering in a way that left no room for doubt. Later they lay together beneath the blankets, the warmth of the stove fading into the night. Wade's hand rested at her back, her breath even against his chest. The closeness was not rushed, not demanded. It was slow, careful, real. The question of whether she belonged by trade or choice was gone. She was his because she had chosen, and he was hers because he had opened his life. Sleep came without fear or uncertainty, only the quiet certainty that they had built something lasting inside those walls. Spring softened the land, the wash running full with meltwater green shoots pressing through earth, gone brown. The cabin no longer looked like a lone outpost against the ridge, but a home clothes drying on a line, laughter spilling at the table. Loretta rose with the sun tying her hair back as she stepped into the small garden she'd planted behind the corral. Rows of beans and squash marked her care soil, turned by her own hands. Wade watched her once from the porch, scar on his cheek, catching the light, and realized he was no longer a man alone. It was theirs now. Folks had long wondered if she was bound by debt or circumstance, but the answers were plain. Her name was written in the county clerk's book as clearly as his. A ring shone on her finger, and every step she took around the cabin proved choice, not chains. Still, the townsfolk of Dusty Creek had their doubts. Whispers followed them on the boardwalk, men muttering, "He'd bought her," women shaking their heads. Wade paid no mind, and Loretta, after weeks of carrying her shoulders tight, learned to meet those stares without flinching. In time, the gossip quieted. People grew used to seeing them side by side. One clear morning, they rode back into town, not for supplies, but for the preacher. They stood before him in a plain church beeswax and dust in the air. A handful of townsfolk gathered, more curious than kind. The deputy who once came to their door leaned at the back hat low, watching with quiet approval. The preacher's words were simple. "Do you take her freely as your wife?" Wade answered without pause. "I do." Then came the preacher's question to Loretta. She lifted her chin. I do. Wade slid the ring back onto her finger before church and law. Loretta's chest tightened, not with fear, but relief. No man could claim her again, not after she spoke her vow before them all. She was wife-partner equal. Afterward, Wade bought 2 slices of pie at the cafe. They ate them side by side at the counter, while townsfolk pretended not to stare. When they mounted up to ride home, Loretta looked back once, meeting the eyes of a woman who had whispered about her before. This time, the woman didn't look away. She gave a small, uncertain nod. The ride home was slow, sun-warm on their backs, mule steady under the weight of supplies. At the cabin, Wade carried in the flour and coffee, while Loretta spread new lace across the table, smoothing it with her palms. She turned to him, voice firm. This is my home now, our home, he answered. That night they sat on the porch steps with mugs of coffee, watching light fade across the ridge. Behind them, the garden rustled in the breeze, cattle lowed in the corral, and the cabin glowed warm with firelight. Wade reached for her hand, rough fingers closing gently around hers. We're family, he said, voice low. Loretta leaned her head to his shoulder, her lips curving with the smallest smile. We are. The story that began in a dusty yard filled with jeers ended here in desert quiet, with 2 people who had chosen each other. No debts, no ropes, no questions. She was no longer the woman sold for $2. She was Loretta Jane Fletcher, wife-partner equal. And Wade, once haunted by solitude, was no longer alone. Night settled soft around them, carrying a certainty neither dared believe months before. They had found their life, and it would hold. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you.